Dr. Richard Williams, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I have with me this book, Fixing Food and FDA Inside Unravels the Myth and the Solutions. And well, there are so many myths and there are so many fake solutions as well. And I'm just so eager to ask you about all that. But before we get into it, I would like to know a little bit about yourself. You started as an economist and then you got into the FDA. Can you tell us, first of all, what is it that you study? And I know that you got into the FDA by accident, but just tell us how that happened.
Well, I was in graduate school. I was studying economics, getting a PhD in economics, and I had actually worked for fast food and never thought I'd have anything to do with food again after working in fast food companies. I had accepted a job. I was in one university, accepted a job at another university, and my dissertation chairman called me. He says, "Richard, I just got a call from FDA. I think you should go in there. I think you could do some good as an economist, and I also think you could get some good stories to tell your classes." So my goal was to go in for 1 to 2 years, and then I ended up leaving 27 years later.
Wow. And was that the standard for them to hire economists, or is this a new barrier that you were breaking?
No, I was the first economist they hired. And so that proved to be a real problem. Nobody knew what an economist was doing there. And when I was first introduced into FDA in the sort of opening introduction, they said, well, you're new here, so you just need to write what we tell you to write, do what we tell you to do, and you'll be fine. And they didn't even know what I was doing there. And they tried to tell me what to write. And so that didn't work too well.
I think at the beginning of the book, you call it economic prostitution.
I did. That was a huge mistake. I didn't know anything about actually the bureaucracy or hardly anything about how to work with people. And I was told after I did a benefit cost analysis and said it doesn't make sense from that perspective to ban this product, which was a hair dye. I was told by one of the staffers, well, you need to write another analysis that now shows it does make sense to ban it. And I said, no, you've got one analysis. That's all I'm doing. And then when I talked to the deputy center director at one of the introductory conferences, I said, boy, this horrible thing happened to me. And he said, I was the one who told you to do that. And that's when I said, I'm not an economic prostitute. I would never do that. And that's when he told me I was fired.
Okay, well, then can we start by the basics? Can you tell us what exactly is the FDA? I mean, we all hear those acronyms and we have a sense, we have an idea of what it means, but I don't know if we really know what that means.
Well, a lot of people don't. They call it the Federal Drug Agency, which it's not. It is the Food and Drug Administration. It's the oldest public health agency in the United States. It was formed in 1906. And today they regulate foods, all foods except for meat and poultry, drugs, animal drugs, tobacco, medical devices. And so it's a gigantic agency. It regulates about 20 cents of every dollar that consumers spend.
Wow. Okay. So in 1906, we had like the Wild West out there. You would create a product and sell it to the market without any kind of regulation, and nobody told you what to do. So how did this came about? Who saw the need to create this government agency?
So there were really two people that played a huge role. One was the author Sinclair Lewis of The Jungle, and he's the one that went into the meat packing plants and saw rats running over the meat. They were defecating on the meat. They'd end up being chopped up in the meat. And he wrote a book about it. He was more concerned about worker conditions. Other than that, over in USDA, there was an obscure chemist named Harvey Wiley, and he began looking at what manufacturers were adding to food intentionally. And they were adding poisons, copper salts. So he had a poison squad, a bunch of young men, and he fed them massive doses of these things, and he figured out which ones were making them sick. And he started publicizing them. And these ended up in women's magazines. And so it came to President Roosevelt, and they said, you need a federal regulatory agency to deal with this. Roosevelt didn't want to do it. So he sent his own men into the meat packing plants, and they came back and said, sure enough, it's really bad. He still didn't want to do it. Finally, somebody told him, and this has nothing to do with FDA, he goes, you can make a 10-year-old scotch by blending whiskeys. And he was outraged over that. So he said, all right, let's just go ahead and sign this bill and we'll get the FDA.
Okay, well, now it's 2021. Can you tell us how does it work, the bureaucracy? Who are all the different stakeholders, and who is the actual decision maker, not the one on the top of the pyramid, but who is really making the decisions?
So in terms of making the decisions, it depends on what the decision is, and it can be on the top of the pyramid. But usually the decision starts with right down in the agency, there's somebody who's in charge of a particular regulation, and they make an initial decision. That can be changed. It can be changed by all the way up to the commissioner. In fact, it can be changed by the president of the United States. To give you an example, when we did food labels, the nutrition facts panels, FDA had created a label, and they had to by law. USDA for meat and poultry created their own label, and the two agencies couldn't agree. And that ended up going to President Bush, the first, H.W. Bush. And the argument went back and forth in front of the president. And finally, the FDA representative said, well, you know, McDonald's is already using our label. And the president said, well, if McDonald's is using it, that's good enough for me. And that's how we got the label we have today.
Wow. Okay. And so it seems to me that we are going through an epidemic, and I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about the epidemic of obesity, and it's making us all weak. I mean, our blood pressure is high, our hearts are failing us, and it's mostly about the poor nutrition that we have. So I wonder why we are not better informed consumers, or why is this happening in general?
Well, it started taking off in about 1980. This is when more people started eating away from home. Certainly one factor. Another factor is we placed a lot of emphasis on total fat. And so people cut their fat back, but when they did, they increased their carbohydrates. And just for example, a couple hundred years ago, Americans would consume an average of 2 to 3 pounds of sugar a year. Today, that average amount is 153 pounds. So we're consuming a lot more sugar. We're consuming a lot more food away from home. And the problem is that the federal government doesn't have good answers for this. The nutrition facts panel is amazingly complex. Almost no one can understand how to use it. They don't track what they eat in terms of calories and other nutrients. And it's hard to compare between two products. Other than that, they've got My Plate from USDA. That's just so simple. It divides foods into food groups. That doesn't tell you what to eat. And then the bigger problem, in a sense almost, is the dietary guidelines. So this is a committee that meets every 5 years, they have since 1980. But the problem is they're issuing advice for everyone. And what we're now beginning to understand is that everybody is unique in terms of your genetics, your microbiome, your health status, your age, and so forth. And so that one diet doesn't work for everybody. We need personalized diets. And I think that's one of the issues that we see so many diets out there. They may or may not work for you, but they certainly don't work for everyone. We need personalized diets in order to take care of this problem.
But there are some guidelines that, in my opinion, they work for almost everyone. For example, you just mentioned that the average American is eating 153 pounds of sugar. I mean, we could say no matter who the person is, less sugar will be better for you. And when we are talking about all this processed food, I mean, I used to eat tons of Doritos, that's processed food, but I mean, logic, I don't know if it's common sense or not, but my now older self let me know that eating all this processed food is perhaps not the best thing for my body. And somehow the average consumer is not getting this information. That I don't know much about science, but I can deduce that all this processed food, all this sugar is not the best thing for my body.
I suspect that's right. There's a huge debate going on in nutrition right now. So historically, we have thought, and people are eating a lot more since 1980, just a lot more calories. And so the historic way of thinking of this is calories in and calories out. So calories in are what you eat, calories out is what you exercise, how much you burn. And that's what determined obesity. There's a debate now that says, well, maybe it's more about what you eat, the types of carbohydrates that basically affect your insulin levels, for example. That debate is far from being settled. But I suspect, yeah, there are probably some general rules. If you're subsisting on half your diet is Doritos, that's probably not a good idea.
Okay, well, you make some big big arguments in your book. You mentioned that the FDA controls Congress, the courts, and the executive branch. Can you tell us how does that happen?
Well, so FDA has been called the most powerful regulatory agency in the world in a book. And it's true, they are very, very good at keeping people who criticize them at bay. So, for example, FDA, with respect to Congress, uh, wants to make sure that their budget continues to increase, and they're very good at that. So they go to Congress, for example, every year, and they say 1 in 6 Americans are getting food poisoning every year. And Congress goes, wow, that's terrible. We need to increase your food budget to do something about it. Congress doesn't seem to remember they've been saying that every year for well over a decade. So that's one way they control Congress, is that they make the same arguments, and Congress doesn't seem to realize they're hearing the same thing year after year. Um, Other than that, they control food companies by passing regulations that are favorable to them, that put their smaller competitors at a disadvantage, and generally keep people at bay.
And okay, it is of course within the benefit of any organization to continue getting funding from Congress, and as well as the FDA. So many other organizations do the same thing. We need a bigger budget for this, whether it's the Army, the FBA, the FDA, whatever organization. How come Congress is not catching up to the same trick that is being played by not only the FDA, but also all the other governments organizations?
That's an excellent question. I wish I had an answer for that. Congress has so much on their plate. It's hard, and they have staffs that do this, but it's extremely difficult, I'm sure, for them to follow all of this.
Okay, your first job, or when you started working at the FDA, was like to do cost benefit analysis, but now you are saying also in the book that the FDA misused this risk assessment and the cost benefit analysis. How is it being misused?
Well, so in my case, for example, on several occasions, I had actually written an analysis. They didn't like the analysis, and so they told me to change it. So here's the way this analysis works. The president, starting with President Carter, and then really sort of getting honed more finely down by President Reagan, said, I want federal regulatory agencies to use cost benefit analysis, the results of a cost benefit analysis, to help make decisions. Federal agencies resented that enormously. People who come into regulatory agencies, usually political appointees, think they're appointed to make decisions, and they don't need economists to tell them what to do, or even to suggest them what they might do. So on the second occasion this happened, I had done an analysis of a seafood regulation. This is a regulation that FDA wanted in order to keep seafood from being moved over to USDA. And it said the costs of this regulation vastly exceed the benefits. They didn't like that. And I said, that's kind of what the truth is. And they said, you either change it or don't come back. They told me this on Friday, change it or don't come back to work on Monday. I had a mortgage, a wife, and a child, and I changed it, but I resolved never to let that happen to me again. And as it turned out, the main problem with seafood at the time was shellfish that's eaten raw, like oysters taken from the Gulf of Mexico. Well, when the oysters are taken from the Gulf, they're already contaminated. There's nothing you can do. If they're just taken and people eat them raw, they're going to get sick, particularly if they're immunocompromised. Well, about 14 years after I got out of FDA, I looked and I had found, almost zero reduction in those cases. In fact, those cases had doubled after we passed this regulation.
Wow, wow. Um, you mentioned that the FDA gets financed by Congress, but also, I mean, as a regular citizen, you hear stories that also the big players are somehow, with their money and their power and the influence, are influences the decision that FDA are taking, or the labeling, or what is allowed or not allowed. Can you tell us how that happens?
Yeah, there's actually a law, actually two laws, the Regulatory Flexibility Act in 1980, and then the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement and Fairness Act, updated in 1986. And it said by law, FDA has to consider disparate impacts on small firms. And so if you think of a company that's making 1 million products, and let's say you make them spend $10,000, on a cost per product, that's pretty small. But if you're a small company and you're only making 1,000 products, the cost is huge. And so you can't pass it on if you're competing with this big company. So that's the kind of impact. And so what the law said is, FDA, look, if small companies aren't really so much at risk, give them some kind of a break. Give them longer to comply, or maybe if there's some things that should only apply to big companies, just exempt them. That doesn't happen, and big companies play a huge role in making sure it doesn't. They have armies of lawyers that will write comments to the FDA and saying, no, everybody should have to do the same thing. They call it a level playing field, which I call leveling the players in the field. And so usually small businesses get caught up in this. They don't have armies of lawyers to write comments. They don't even know what's going on. They don't even read the Federal Register. They don't have time. They're just trying to, pay their employees and keep going. And that's an unfortunate side of regulations.
Wow. When I go shopping with my friends, my friend in particular, she likes to see the back of the labels, and she likes to, I really don't know what all these compounds and chemicals mean, but she seems to know what it means and she reads them. But you mentioned, or you insinuate that food labeling have been a disaster. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily say it's a disaster. It just hasn't worked. And when we put the food labels on, I was, in charge of doing all the benefits and costs. I thought the benefits were going to be huge, meaning people are going to look at these labels, they're going to read them, they were going to understand them, they were going to change and choose healthier foods, and that was going to reduce heart disease and cancer. None of that happened. People read them, but they don't necessarily, you can't use them to compare between two products. There's just too many things that you have to compare at once, and particularly for an individual. So it hasn't really improved health. FDA continues to tinker with it. They put calories in bold as though that would make a huge difference. I doubt it. So I do think there are other ways to go. I think, continuing to mess with the food label isn't really going to help us.
How about in the innovation department? Has the FDA come with any new innovations to determine how safe our food is?
Well, it's not FDA's job necessarily to come up with the innovations. That comes from the private industry, right? From innovators, and it's really coming from innovators around the world. And people are creating lots of stuff to make food safer. So for example, the new proteins, which are created in relatively sterile labs, will be a lot safer than the conventional meats that we get off of farms. Now, people may not quite be ready to accept those, but things like Beyond Meat and the Impossible Burger, those things are certainly going to be safer. They're ultimately going to be more nutritious and certainly better for the environment. But that's just one thing. We're seeing innovators coming up with new food packaging, nano packaging that would alert you to when the food is going bad. That's a fascinating thing. And then one of the things that's most fascinating for me, I actually can't wait to get, is a 3D food printer. And so this is something where you feed the fats and the carbohydrates and so forth in, and then it will print out any kind of food that you want. And so one thing, this helps with precision nutrition, so you can have an individualized diet through individualized products. It also helps not waste so much food because you just print out what you're going to eat.
Wow, that sounds so amazing. Just to let you know, I am a big fan and a client of all these new meats. I buy my Beyond Meat sausages and burgers. Yeah, once a month or so. So I am a big fan of those discovery. But there are other new medical devices that you mentioned that are making a nutrition as easy as using a cell phone.
Right. So this is another thing that's just fascinating. And again, this is coming, I've talked to people as far away as Australia. Peter Brains in Nutromics is doing it. So what it's doing is going to help us monitor what we eat. Then it's going to look at your individual characteristics. So what is your genetic background, your microbiome, your health status, your age, and so forth. And then make recommendations for what you should eat. Also based on what you like. It's not going to tell you to, eat Brussels sprouts if you don't like Brussels sprouts. And you'd get it on something like a Fitbit or, perhaps your phone or something like that. So a lot better than trying to figure out the nutrition, the complexity of the nutrition facts panel. I think these things are going to revolutionize food personally.
May I ask you, and now coming back to you personally, what is it that make you decide to write this book now?
Well, a couple of things. Toward the end of my career at FDA, I became convinced that I had wasted a lot of time, that we were going in the wrong direction. We weren't making food any safer. The 1 in 6 thing just stayed the same. And then when I looked at obesity in particular, we're definitely going in the wrong direction. In adults, obesity has doubled in the United States since 1970. In children, it's quadrupled. And along with that has come a lot more childhood diabetes. We expect by 2030, just the end of this decade, half of all Americans will be obese. That's going to bring more chronic disease, more heart disease, more diabetes, and all sorts of issues. We've got to do something. So I think it's an urgent problem. Some of the estimates for poor nutrition are somewhere between 400,000 people and perhaps as many as 600,000 people die from poor nutrition, also lack of exercise. So if that's equivalent to what's going on with COVID. So I think of this as a pandemic. It's certainly an epidemic. And I think now is the time we've got to do something about it. And I think for FDA's part, what I'd like to see them do is to be more proactive in helping to get these things onto the market, make sure they're safe, but not unnecessarily block some of these new innovations coming onto the market.
And what do you think about the regulations that, for example, Mexico is trying to impose, such as a sugar tax? And of course, they are trying to tax at a higher rate Coca-Cola and other of those soft drinks. I mean, it seems like it's common knowledge now that high amount of sugar is not good for you. And we have all that information available to us. I mean, the FDA can only go as so far, and some other measures have to be taken as well.
Yeah, I'm not a big favor of taxes, particularly our taxes that are regressive. This is going to affect more people more than others. What I would like to see is to create better products that are equally, taste equally good and are cheap as well, that people would choose over those products. I understand the reasoning for taxation. You can do that now. You can do it quickly. But again, I'm always concerned about regressive impacts.
Yeah. At the same time, this regressive tax is these people who are consuming it, the ones who seems to be in the biggest need to be taxed.
Alan, that's an excellent point. I certainly think that's true.
Okay, well, this is fascinating. It opens one more window to know not only how politics and the system works, but also to inform us better on the kind of foods that are good for us and that are harmful for us. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do?
Yeah, it's Fixing Food, and FDA Insider uncovers the myths and the realities. And they can go on my website, richardawilliams.com, and you can find the book there. You can find it on in any bookstore or on Amazon. Also, if they're interested, I put out a weekly post, and all you have to do is sign up. Just give me your email address, and I'll send you a weekly post for free.
Wow, I think I'm going to put my name on that list. Richard, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been really fun talking to you.